Ethnography and the move. I think you'll see through the course of what I'm about to talk about why I want you to focus and think about mobility as part of the ethnographic imaginary. James Clifford, in a book called Roots, Travel and Translation in the late 20th century, has some interesting things to say in this regard, and you may recognise Clifford as a key commentator, a critical friend of the discipline, a historian of the discipline. In this book, he opens with some reflections from the novelist Amitav Ghosh, who was trained initially as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer. And in a piece he wrote, The Imam and the Indian, very early, which then features very early on in Clifford's book, he quotes him as follows: "When I first came to that quiet corner of the Nile Delta, where he'd come to do field work, I'd expected to find on that most ancient and most settled of soils a settled and restful people." And he couldn't have been more wrong. And he then makes this point about the restlessness of the people, the movement of the men at least, that characterised the place. It seemed to him that the only person standing still was the anthropologist. Fascinating stuff. Some of them had passports so thick they opened out like ink-blackened concertinas. So Clifford uses these ideas from Ghosh, the inspiration he offers, to make the following observation about the generations from Malinowski and Mead, and how professional ethnography, which I think we have to really say is professional anthropology perhaps, is this where this really more belongs than in the more general idea of ethnography, based on intensive dwelling, albeit of course temporary in delimited fields. But in Ghosh's account, fieldwork is less a matter of localised dwelling and more a series of travel encounters. Everyone's on the move, except for the anthropologist, who of course has arrived there, has come from somewhere else for the most part. Everyone's on the move, has been for centuries, dwelling in travel. In fact, as Clifford would argue, I think we all are part of that. The anthropologist also dwells in travel. So he talks about ethnography then as localised dwelling, as how it's often pictured, and depicts it in this way as centering the culture under investigation around the particular locus of the village, construed as bounded sites, particularly suitable for intensive visiting by anthropologists. I think you can hear some of the irony that's dripping out of that statement. Now look, I've used this idea in a very recent piece of writing that should be published before too long in a handbook of ethnography and education, to make that the following point about imageries and imaginaries that have annealed to this particular methodological construct, the localised dwelling, and resulting in idealised forms of practice by which the worth of ethnographic research is often judged. And just to help highlight that, lovely essay from Passereau, in an important book, Anthropological Locations, Boundaries and Grounds of a Field Science, it's really problematising this notion of place and of the field in anthropological research. She makes the following point very early on in this piece about research that she'd conducted, her PhD research amongst the homeless people in New York City. And the question that flowed often from this when she started to talk about that amongst professional anthropologists was whether or how frequently she'd slept out on the streets. And I'll just continue reading from there. The disappointment that invariably followed my emphatic no, never, seemed to lay bare important assumptions about ethnographic knowledge, raising interesting questions about how subjecting oneself to physical danger might still be part of a rite of passage aspect of fieldwork. Even if we no longer romanticize exotic natives, we can nonetheless continue to romanticize the young ethnographer and his ethnographic project. Now the romance, I think, is happening in a few different ways. So romancing danger, as she makes the point there, I must admit that's something I've never really thought about too much, probably because my research was in a middle-class high school in Perth. But I do think that there's a romance associated with the sort of study that takes place. So that I think there's a romance of solidarity that I think is a very important aspect of this. And tied in with that is an idea or an imaginary about the sort of people that anthropologists, social scientists work with. There's a downward gaze, a subaltern gaze, as Marcus calls it, that so often is a part of anthropological practice. So that being with and being able to show that one can be with the downtrodden, the oppressed, those who need lifting up, can also be a part of the romance. So, of course, to go home to one's comfortable bed at night might be seen as a bit of a failure in that regard. So I think there's other romance at play in the ways in which things are imagined. And I think imagining ethnography is an important part of what I'm inviting you to do now. And what happens to the research processes is we start to imagine ethnography less as intensive dwelling and more as travel. What could and would happen to ethnographic practice if our research sites shifted to coffee shops, airport lounges, buses and trains, places of transitory movement, discussion boards on the World Wide Web is another example, and that's an area that I have actually written about fairly recently. Now, it already has happened in all sorts of places, but it's not without contestation and friction, and a contestation and friction that I would suggest to you has something to do with the imaginary, the ways in which one sees and idealizes the ethnographic research process. Now, here's a paper that picks up on an imaginary of travel. It's written for the journal Mobility, so it's got a particular focus, as it must do when it goes into a journal like that. And it's a study of high school students on Sydney's trains by Colin Symes, who's an Australian academic in education sphere. And so here's a paper that I'm throwing at you this week. So it's one of the readings for this week. Firstly, actually, is an example of a paper written about doing ethnographic research that reports some of that research to you. So it's a little bit about how to do it and how to write about it. So it's got that element to it, as well, of course, of illustrating a form of ethnography on the move, although I think we could probably bring to question whether or not it actually does move away from that that business of habituation, of some form of connection in place, despite the fact that it's in such a mobile space. The space itself doesn't change very much. Anyway, have a read of it and we can discuss it in class. A paper that I've not set for this week but was tempted to do is Ortner's very recent paper, which he called Dark Anthropology and Its Others, and it's about theory since the 80s. She's making the point, of course, it's not just about theory, but that theory affects practice. Academic work in the social sciences cannot be detached from the conditions of the real world in which it takes place. Theoretical frameworks we use, the phenomena we choose to explore, are affected in myriad ways by the political, economic and cultural circumstances in which we carry out our research. Since the 80s, Ortner's focus, good political economist that she is, a strong political economy focus in her work, is on neoliberalism and its effects. And she suggests that where that has taken anthropologists to is some fairly dark places, reflections that have a certain pessimism to them that she wants to question, and closes, in fact, with that Gramscian notion of optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect as part of what she's talking about. But just picking up this notion, as you'll see I was just doing in that little flash through there, of time and place and time, the different ideas that move around. So we think about Marx as a predecessor of the other two pictured here, Durkheim and Weber, who clearly are contemporaries, only out by a couple of years in each other's lifespan there. Marx getting in quite a bit earlier than them in his writing. If we think about those founders and what they come to signify, and of course Marx signifies the critical approach, the conflict approach to doing social research, Durkheim often a structural functional approach, and Weber more of an interactionist approach, the ways in which human beings make meaning in this. Now, this chart is a heuristic device, a way of getting inside a set of ideas. It is not in any way meant to reflect any close, strong empirical study. It's just meant to be something there to think with. If we think about the ways in which these three broad theoretical approaches have come to affect the ways in which ethnography is conducted and the kinds of knowledge it produces. Now, I think it's possible to just think about structural functionalism as reaching some sort of a peak in the 1950s and starting to decline in influence, but never going away. It remains active, it remains part of it. And I think it's important to think about these ideas as somehow a bit like sound or light, as physicists imagine this, light really more than anything, as both energy and waves, you know, so moving through these waves that are always around us. I guess radio waves is another way I'd like to think of it, that they're always present, and we depending on how receptive we are or the kind of receptors we're using, we'll hear some and not others. Depending on how we tune into it, we'll hear some and not others. But they're always there. These have always been part of the intellectual soundscape or energyscape that's around us. Conflict theory, reaching some sort of a peak towards in the 60s, in that radical 60s and 70s. And, you know, waning a little, but still very much the sort of dominant commitment, especially in anthropology and sociology. Some would argue in Anglophone sociology, and some would even say, well, yes, all except the US, which tends to follow much more of a structural functional approach. That's the argument of some, at least. Interactionism, the idea that the individual is a meaning maker, is not just hemmed in by structures, as these two perspectives suggest, not just an economic animal, we're a meaning-making animal, a much more individualized focus. You'll read a paper soon that suggests that Chicago School started to really develop an interactionist perspective on this, and you can see various elements of that. Now look, this is where I'm really a bit shaky, on shaky ground, especially with this device. It may well be that it should just follow a bit more like this. I'm certainly not trying to say that it declined in impact. It's probably stayed fairly steady. But I actually think that we could argue that interactionism got some sort of a hit in the postmodern era. As you start to believe less and less in the structures and the dominant narratives, the grand narratives of that high modern period captured here, and move more to a more individualizing culture, a late modernity, second modernity idea, a postmodern idea, then this starts to take hold much more, and we get much more of an interactionist appreciation and effect. Ethnography has always relied, of course, on interaction, has always thought about the human being in amongst these structures in some way or another. But there's been, again, different emphases, and there continues to be. I mean, what's going to happen? What part of what I'm trying to put to you here is, where do you position yourself? Where do you think you stand in relation to this? Which particular approach are you more inclined towards? And it's not an either-or choice. It's more about inclinations. It's more about preferences, I think. So your first reading this week is from the man depicted here, captured here by photograph, Michael Burroway. Quite a well-known sociologist, has been president of the American Sociological Association, a journeyman in all sorts of ways, although he has lived in the US for quite some time. He was born in the UK, I believe. Introduction to his book, his multiple-authored book called Global Ethnography, Forces, Connections, Imaginations in a Postmodern World. And in this introduction, he does a grand job. It's a very grand sweep of ethnographic history. And he starts pretty much in the Chicago School of Sociology, making the point that the early work, the Polish peasant in Europe and the US, could well and showed a real inclination towards thinking about the broader context of human lives, and particularly in relation to capital. I think you'll definitely pick the political perspective that Burroway comes from. But he said that what happened was he would argue, I think, that it's lost its way and got caught up in a symbolic interactionist commitment to much more to individualizing ideas, which can get you caught up in missing the politics, starting to blame the victim, or showing how those who are disadvantaged in society contribute to their disadvantage. The school that he's much more interested in is the Manchester School of Anthropology and their extended case method. Now, he outlines that quite well for you there, I think. Well, he does certainly better than I could for you, that's for sure. And, I mean, one of the reasons is because he is so enamoured of it, because he was trained in that particular method himself, as he points out. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And he's now in Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and he talks about really the Berkeley School and the kinds of contributions that are being made there to extended case method, as he would call it, as he would frame it, to ethnographic practice. And again, that's to be picked up in the paper. The extended case method that he's so enamoured of, he gives it 4 characteristics, and this is one way of thinking about ethnography, and it may be one that really resonates with you, that you're highly sympathetic to, and that you want to pick up on and extend. So the extension of the observer into the world of the participant, extension of the observations over time and space, so it's not just focused on that single locale, extending out from micro process to macro forces. The Manchester schools cut their teeth really looking at labour migration in various parts of Africa, and the ways in which the movement to the global capitalist movement was really causing and forcing people or causing people to leave their locales that they might otherwise have more or less stayed in, to follow employment opportunities. And so they were looking at the ways in which that was changing traditional practices, changing ways of life in those nations, but certainly not just simply as disruption, but also as continuities of practice as well. And the other point that he talks about there as being part of the extended case method is the extension of theory. Pushing theory along should always be part of what's happening. Now, returning to Ortner and her dark anthropology and its others, there's a little footnote she puts very early on in the piece where she makes this point. There are many other factors behind this shift at this point, so it's not just neoliberalism that is causing the shifts in anthropological focus. Among other things, one would have to look more closely at other tensions within the field, particularly those surrounding the publication of writing culture. Unfortunately, it cannot be dealt with within the confines of this article. And it can't be dealt with in the confines of this article because Ortner is so committed to a political economy approach. And writing culture is part of that movement to a more interactionist, a more individualized focus, certainly a more postmodern focus. So just thinking quickly about this, dare I call it a key text, but heralding a new postmodernism in anthropology. A crisis is one way in which it sometimes gets described, causing a shift, or perhaps it was even a turning point. Perhaps the writing culture was part of a postmodern turn in the disciplines in which we operate. Those who celebrate it for challenging older forms of authority, forms of representation, those grand narratives of earlier times, challenging a colonialist anthropology, and also a positivist or a naturalist form of ethnography. They were actually there was a couple of authors in there talking about ethnography as fiction. And we should be accepting that and writing in that particular way. They were talking the poetics, captured in the poetics and politics of ethnography, captured in that subtitle. That writing poetry is a very legitimate way of writing ethnography. Maybe you want to take something of that on in what you're doing and what you're about to do. Criticised for postmodern navel-gazing, commitment to reflexivity that was so much a part of that, so it becomes the self that becomes the important tool of investigation here. It's not so much what other people are experiencing, but what I'm experiencing of other people that gets criticised. And in that you can hear the tension between a positive naturalist ethnography, positivist natural ethnography, and a more reflexive form. Excessive textualism, avoiding the hard work of, say, cross-cultural analysis, of not actually not really paying enough attention to the data that gets generated. And also criticised for leading politics, for not paying attention to the political economy that underpins so much of this practice. All very well to be reflexive, but if you don't think about the power at play, then you're missing some of the points. Now, some of the authors from this text would want to argue against these criticisms. Of course, they would. But there's some of the context in which this particular piece was produced. After Writing Culture is a book that was then produced about 10 years after the event by British anthropologists, James, Hockey and Dawson, all of whom were at the University of Hull at that time. And this book actually is from is drawn from a meeting of the British Association of Social Anthropologists. They make the point here, so 10 years on, the sense of crisis, the ways in which it's going to cripple us, we're not going to be able to produce anything more, and people aren't going to go off and do field work in distant places. Well, that never came to pass. the kind of critique that, that writing culture offered became part of the mainstream in anthropology without really disrupting it in any grand way. So it's possible to see the debate that ensued as a crystallization of uncertainties about anthropology subject matter, traditionally the other, as well as its method, participant observation, its medium, the monograph, and its intention, informing. Its intention of informing rather than its own form of practice. And 10 years on, that all looks to be a little bit overblown, some of the objections to it, as of course may have been some of the grand claims that were being made around it. What of course we end up doing is recognizing what it was signaling to us, how it reflected the times and the ways in which thinking around anthropological and ethnographic practice was shifting, and in disciplines beyond, because after writing culture was impacted possibly more beyond anthropology than it did within. So we've got these changes taking place, social change impacting the ways in which we think about the world, then impacting, of course, then on practice and the sorts of product that we get out of the discipline. What does all this mean for you? So I've just given you a quick overview of some of the arenas and making sure that some parts aren't completely ignored in what you read. Burrowoy certainly does not talk about the writing culture episode. Well, in a unit focused on ethnography, well then maybe we need to think about what participant observation means. It is extremely significant, remains so, a perfectly respectable way to conduct ethnographic research. No argument at all with that. It might even be the gold standard. I'm quite prepared to entertain arguments along those lines. You'll get challenges from me about it, but that doesn't matter. I mean, that's part of the point. There are colleagues of mine who would see it in that particular way. Perfectly respectable, perfectly acceptable, and I certainly would not penalize anybody for not thinking the same way that I do. Partly see what I'm trying to say here is that it's a contested space now. That's part of the deal. It's part of this late modern, postmodern era that we're in. And any of us who are writing in this area are going to be part of that contestation. And we have to accept that we're not the only ones who think in that particular way. That's surely part of the times that we're in as well. So it's not the only way. And what I would just like to suggest to you is this, that the method should fit the questions, not the other way around. So because you want to interrogate a particular aspect of social life, the question we then ask, well, what's the best way to do this? Not how can we fit participant observation around it. That's part of the point I want to make. So thinking about ethnography, I want to also put this point to you, that ethnography is not participant observation. We should try to treat them separately if we possibly can, although in much of what you read, they are treated as interchangeably, as synonyms to make the writing more interesting and the reading of it. It may be more useful to think of it as a product than as a process, to think of ethnography as product rather than process, but I still think we need to grapple with, and I'll say this quite openly and honestly, I'm still grappling with what makes the portrait of a people ethnographic. Part of what I'm really looking forward to in engaging with a bunch of students, with you in this, is to hear what you've got to say and to help me think my way through some of these issues. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to what's going to come up this week. And as you'll see, the work gets laid out for you for this particular week in writing ahead of us. Okay, good luck with it all. See you soon.